Hey guys, tonight we are going to do something a little different. We are traveling back in time, not to witness a battle or the building of a monument, but to explore something far more intimate and, frankly, a lot more confusing. We are stripping away the pristine white marble of the statues and getting into the messy, human reality of what love, desire, and relationships were actually like in ancient Greece. And just a friendly heads up. If you were suddenly dropped into ancient Athens with your modern ideas of romance, you would probably be considered, well, let us just say indifferently strange. And your notions of dating would be about as useful as a screened or on a submarine. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, drop a comment below and let me know what city you are listening from, and what time it is. It is always fascinating to see where we are all connecting from across the globe. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let us ease into tonight's journey together. The first thing you notice is not a grand philosophical idea or a perfectly proportioned temple. It is the smell. It is a mix of dry dust from the unpaved roads, the sharp scent of olive oil that seems to cling to everything, a distant salt mist from the Aegean Sea, and a less than romantic hint of open drains. The sun feels different here, too. Brighter, harsher, casting sharp, unforgiving shadows. You have landed in classical Athens, somewhere around the 5th century BC. You are here to understand love. But the moment you start looking for it, you realize your map is all wrong. The single, all-encompassing word love that you use to describe your feelings for pizza, your partner, and that one show you binge-watched last weekend, it does not really exist here in the same way. The Greeks have broken it down, dissected it, and given its different parts different names, because to them, these feelings are not the same at all. First, there is Eros, and you need to get the image of a chubby, cute little baby with a bow and arrow out of your head. Here, Eros is a powerful, terrifying, and often destructive force. It is a divine madness, a sickness sent by the gods to throw your life into chaos. It is the raw, burning, uncontrollable desire that makes people do stupid, heroic, and often regrettable things. When a poet writes about Eros, he is not writing about holding hands. He is writing about being shot, being set on fire, being a victim of a cosmic prey. It is a passion that you endure, not one that you cultivate. It is seen as dangerous, fleeting, and absolutely not the foundation for a stable life or, heaven forbid, a marriage. Then, there is Philia. This is the good stuff. This is the noble stuff. It is the deep, affectionate friendship and loyalty you feel for your comrades, your family, and your city. It is the bond between soldiers standing shoulder to shoulder in a phalanx, trusting each other with their lives. It is the intellectual connection between a teacher and his students. In many ways, the Greeks valued Philia far more than Eros. It was rational, dependable, and virtuous. While Eros could make you a fool, Philia made you a better man. You will also hear about a game, a more selfless, universal love for humanity, though it is a concept that philosophers are just beginning to wrestle with. And then there is street ward, the quiet, comfortable, and frankly, an exciting affection you have for your family, the kind of love a parent has for a child, or you might have for a loyal dog. It is about familiarity and dependency. So, you are standing in this bustling, noisy agora, the central marketplace, and you see all these concepts in motion. But none of them neatly map onto your idea of a romantic couple. The entire society operates on a set of rules that feels alien. It is not a free-for-all. In fact, it is incredibly rigid. It is just that the rulebook is written in a language you do not yet understand. As you navigate the crowds, you notice something about the men. The beards. A thick, well-kept beard is not just a style choice. It is a man's public resume. It signals that he is a mature, full citizen, a man of authority and substance. To be a clean-shaven adult man would be deeply suspicious, suggesting you are either prepubescent, a foreigner with strange habits, or perhaps morally questionable. Historians point out that when Alexander the Great later insisted his soldiers shave so enemies could not grab their beards in combat, it was a radical cultural shift. For now, the beard is a key part of the masculine ideal, and this is where you encounter a question that still keeps classicists up at night, fueling endless academic debates. When you read a poem by Sappho or a dialogue by Plato, are they describing the same internal, fluttering, heart-pounding sensation of falling in love that you would recognize? Or was their experience of Eros a fundamentally different psychological and cultural state, shaped so profoundly by their world that it is something we can never truly feel? We can translate the words, but we cannot translate the soul. Historians still argue over whether the love they felt was an emotion as we know it, or a set of social and physiological responses conditioned by their beliefs about gods, status, and the body itself. It is a disorienting realization. You came here looking for love stories, but you have found a complex system of social engineering, divine threats, and deep friendships that occupy the space where you expected romance to be. Before anyone here would even care about your capacity for Philia or your vulnerability to Eros, they would be making a much more immediate judgment. Because in ancient Greece, before words are even exchanged, the first and most important conversation is a silent one, and it is all about what you look like. So, you are standing there under the Athenian sun, and you can feel the weight of unspoken judgment. Your body is being read like a text, and in this culture, it is the most important text there is. This is not about fleeting attraction. It is about a deeply ingrained philosophical and social principle. Kalokogathea. It is a mouthful, I know, but it is a simple, and rather ruthless, idea. The beautiful is the good. A beautiful, well-proportioned body is not just nice to look at. It is considered the outward sign of a good, noble, and virtuous soul. A flawed body suggests a flawed character. It is that simple and that brutal. For man, the ideal is on display everywhere. Just look at the statues they are carving. They celebrate a body that is the peak of athletic and military readiness. Those rippling muscles on the Kuro statues are not just for show. They signify a man who spends his time at the gymnasium, training his body for warfare and athletic competition. The duties of a good citizen. He is strong, poised, and visibly disciplined. His physique advertises his dedication to the polis, the city-state. He has the strength to hold a heavy bronze, shield and the stamina to march for days. His beauty is his virtue made visible. But as you look closer at these statues, you will notice a detail that clashes sharply with modern sensibilities. The male genitalia are consistently small, and there is a very specific reason for this. In the Greek mindset, a large, erect penis was associated with lust, barbarism, and a lack of self-control. You see it on lecherous, half-animal satyrs in their myths, or on crude caricatures of foreign enemies. The ideal Greek man, the pinnacle of civilization and reason, was master of his passions. Therefore, his small, non-aroused state was a symbol of his intellectual and moral superiority. It was a testament to his self-control, his soft rosy knee. It is one of those historical details that makes you realize just how culturally constructed our ideas of attractiveness really are. Now, what about the women? Here, the ideal is a little more hidden, because respectable women were largely hidden from public life. You will not find as many statues of nude women from this classical period. That becomes more popular later. But from vase paintings and poetry, you get a clear picture. The ideal woman is softer. Her body less defined by hard muscle. A certain plumpness around the hips and thighs is valued, as it suggests health and, most importantly, fertility. Her skin should be pale, which was a class signifier. A pale complexion meant you were a woman of a wealthy household who did not have to work outside in the sun. It was a literal stat, a symbol worn on the skin. And here is another little detail that will probably make you tilt your head. One of the most prized features of female beauty was the unibrow. That is right. A single, dark, unbroken line of eyebrow arching across the forehead was considered incredibly alluring and a mark of great beauty. The Greeks called it an ophrys. Women who were not naturally blessed with it would use a dark pigment, like coal or soot, to fill in the gap. It is a striking reminder that what one culture considers a flaw to be plucked away, another might see as the height of sophistication. So, you are surrounded by these living ideals. Men striving for the chiseled perfection of the god Apollo. Women cultivating a pale skin, well-fed look. But as you look from the real people in the marketplace to the flawless marble statues gleaming in the temples, you have to ask a crucial question, one that historians and art historians are still debating fiercely to this day. Were the statues meant to be realistic? Did the best, most beautiful Athenians actually look like this? Or were these sculptures a form of propaganda? An impossible, divine standard that everyone was meant to aspire to but no one could ever reach. Some scholars argue that they are indeed idealized versions of elite athletes and citizens, a celebration of what was achievable. Others contend they are more like the ancient equivalent of heavily photoshopped magazine covers or Instagram filters, a deliberately non-human perfection designed to represent the divine and inspire awe, not to be a literal mirror of reality. We just do not know for sure how much was real and how much was aspirational. This obsession with the perfect body, this belief that your physical form is a window to your soul, funnels every citizen towards their designated purpose. For a man, it is to be a strong, disciplined defender of the city. For a woman, her beautiful and healthy body has one primary, overarching function: to be a vessel for the next generation of citizens. Her body is a promise of healthy, legitimate sons, and this promise is to be formalized, legalized, and locked down in the most important social contract of her life. A contract that looks a lot less like a romance and a lot more like a business merger. You are about to witness a wedding. The air does not smell of romantic anticipation. It smells of roasting meat and old wine. You are not about to witness a union of two souls deeply in love. You are watching a transaction, a carefully arranged transfer of assets. The ancient Greek wedding is less about the couple and more about the two families involved. Its primary purpose is cold and practical: to create a legitimate heir who can inherit the father's property and carry on the family name. Love is not on the checklist. In fact, if the bride and groom happened to like each other, it would be considered a strange but fortunate bonus, like finding an extra olive in your jar. The bride is probably a girl you would consider shockingly young, maybe 14 or 15 years old. She has lived her entire life in the seclusion of her father's home, in the Guinea Sea out, the women's quarters. She has had very little contact with any men outside of her immediate family. The groom, on the other hand, is likely much older, perhaps in his late 20s or early 30s. He is a seasoned citizen who has completed his military service and is ready to establish his own household. His oikos, they have likely never met before today. Their parents arranged this whole affair, with the fathers negotiating the most important part of the deal, the dowry. The dowry is not just a gift. It is a crucial piece of the puzzle. It is a substantial amount of property, money, or goods that the bride's father gives to the groom. This is not for the groom to spend freely. Legally, it is meant to support the wife throughout her marriage, and it remains, in a sense, her property. If the husband decides to divorce her, and he could, for almost any reason, he is legally obligated to return the full dowry to her father. This was a powerful incentive for him to not just cast her aside on a whim. It also, unfortunately, made the wife's value inextricably tied to her family's wealth. A girl from a poor family with no dowry had very few prospects for a respectable marriage. Now, let us get to the ceremony itself, which is a multi-day affair. The day before the wedding, the bride, whom you can see clutching a few childhood toys, makes a symbolic sacrifice. She dedicates her dolls, her girlhood clothes, and the lock of her hair to the gods, particularly Artemis, the goddess of chastity and protector of young girls. It is a poignant and slightly sad moment, a formal farewell to her childhood. She is leaving one life behind entirely. The wedding day begins with a ritual bath. Both the bride and groom bathe in water brought from a sacred spring. This is not just about getting clean. It is a symbolic act of purification. The bride is then dressed in a special tunic, the peplos, and a veil that covers her face entirely, a symbol of her modesty. She is adorned with jewelry provided by her family, a final display of their wealth and her status. The main event is the feast, held at the bride's father's house. Men and women are, of course, seated separately. You notice the bride sits veiled and silent through most of it, not eating. It is a somber affair for her. The real climax of the wedding day is the procession. As evening falls, the groom will ceremoniously abduct the bride from her family's home. It is a piece of performative theater, a reenactment of old, more brutal traditions. He grabs her by the wrist, a gesture of ownership, and leads her to a chariot or a cart. This procession through the streets is the public announcement of the marriage. People line the way, singing celebratory songs, shouting jokes, and throwing nuts and fruits, symbols of fertility. The bride is flanked by the groom on one side and his best man, the parochos, on the other. It is a loud, torchlit, and slightly chaotic journey from her old life to her new one. When they arrive at the groom's house, his mother is waiting at the door with a torch. The couple is showered with more nuts and figs as they cross the threshold. This act of crossing into his home is the legal moment the marriage becomes official. There is no priest, no signed document, just this public move from one house to another. Here is our little tidbit for you. One of the final rituals involves the bride eating a quince. This specific fruit was associated with Aphrodite and was thought to promote fertility and pleasant-smelling breath. The idea, prescribed by the Athenian lawgiver Solon, was that her first intimate encounter with her husband should be a pleasant one. It is a small, almost touchingly practical detail in an otherwise impersonal process. As the guests finally leave, the bride is escorted to the bedchamber, and a friend of the groom stands guard outside the door, sometimes singing a loud song to drown out any noises from within. This is the amium, and here lies a question historians still debate, given the age difference, the complete lack of prior acquaintance, and the terrifying nature of this transition for the young bride. What was that first night actually like? The romantic poetry of the era paints one picture, but the social and legal realities suggest something far more clinical, and likely traumatic. Scholars are divided on how much the abduction ritual reflected the bride's actual emotional state. Was it a terrifying reality, or just an accepted, ancient tradition that everyone understood was symbolic? It is hard to know what was going through that young girl's mind as the door to her new life closed. She has a new title now. She is a Damar, a wife. But her world, instead of opening up, is about to become smaller than ever before. The door to your new home closes, and the sound echoes with a note of finality. You are now a wife, a join in grief, and your world has just shrunk to the size of this house. This house, the Oikos, is your new kingdom, but you are its manager, not its monarch. Your husband is the undisputed king. Your primary function, the very reason for your existence here, is twofold: to manage his household efficiently and, most importantly, to produce a legitimate male heir. Everything else is secondary. Your domain is the gyneceum, the women's quarters, usually located on the upper floor or at the back of the house. This is where you will spend the vast majority of your life. It is a space designed for seclusion, intentionally set apart from the undrawn. The men's quarters, where your husband entertains his friends. You are not to be seen by his guests. A respectable wife's reputation is built on her invisibility to the outside world. The great statesman Pericles famously said that the greatest glory of a woman is to be least talked about by men, whether in praise or in blame. Your goal is to be a ghost outside your own home. Your daily life is a routine of domestic management. You are in charge of all the household supplies. The olive oil, the wine, the grain. You are responsible for the household budget, ensuring nothing is wasted. You oversee the slave, assigning them their tasks: spinning, weaving, cooking, cleaning. The most important of these tasks is woolworking. The ability to spin thread and weave cloth is the hallmark of a good wife. It is the female equivalent of a man's skill in battle. On vase paintings, you often see respectable women depicted holding a spindle or a loom. It is their symbol of virtue and industry. Here is a curious little detail about that domestic life. One of your most important tools is a set of keys. You, as the mistress of the house, hold the keys to the storerooms. This is a huge symbol of your authority within the home. In a world where you have virtually no public power, being the keeper of the keys to the family's sustenance is a significant responsibility. It signifies your husband's trust in your ability to manage his property. To lose or misuse these keys would be a source of profound shame. You cannot just pop out to the market, the agora, whenever you feel like it. That is a man's world. If you need something, you send a trusted male slave. A respectable woman from a well-to-do family only leaves the house for a few specific reasons: a religious festival, a funeral, or to visit a female relative. And even then, you must be accompanied, usually by a slave or an older female family member. Your face would be veiled. The streets are not for you. They are seen as a place of temptation and potential corruption. Your relationship with your husband is one of respect and duty, not of companionship in the modern sense. He is your Kyrios, your lord or master. You eat your meals separately. He eats with his male friends in the undrawn. You eat with the children and female slaves in the gyneceum. You do not engage in the philosophical discussions, the political debates, or the witty banter of his social life. You are not educated in these matters. A woman's education was purely domestic, focused on the skills she would need to run a household. Literacy among women was not common, and for many, It was considered unnecessary, even undesirable. Of course, your husband will visit you in your quarters for the purpose of procreation. This is your marital duty. But the idea of sharing your deepest thoughts and feelings with him is a foreign concept. That kind of emotional and intellectual intimacy is something he seeks elsewhere, with his male friends, in the symposium or the gymnasium. Your role is fundamentally different. This raises a question that social historians continue to grapple with. Within this incredibly restrictive system, what were the emotional realities? Did wives and husbands develop genuine affection and philia for each other over time? The official sources, written entirely by men, are largely silent on the wife's perspective. They talk about duty, honor, and lineage, but there are hints, small clues in tragedies or epitaphs, of genuine grief when a wife dies, suggesting that deep bonds could indeed form despite the rigid social structure. Some scholars argue that the system was so oppressive that true companionship was impossible. Others believe that within the private space of the oikos, away from public scrutiny, more complex and loving relationships could flourish. We are left to read between the lines of a story written by only one side. For now, your life is a quiet rhythm of weaving, managing, and waiting. You are the silent partner in the great project of the Athenian family. But your husband, when he leaves the house and enters the world of men, steps into a very different landscape of desire and relationships, one where the rules of attraction are far more complex and far more public. Now, step out of the quiet, shadowed confines of the Guinea Sea amond into the bright, dusty, and exclusively male world of the agora and the gymnasium. Your husband, the respectable citizen, operates in a social landscape where the most intense, celebrated, and poetically praised relationships are often between men. But to understand this, you have to discard your modern labels of gay or straight. Those identities did not exist. What mattered was not the gender of the person you were attracted to, but your role in the act, which was rigidly defined by age and status. This brings us to one of the most famous, and to us, most problematic, aspects of Greek society, paideristia. This translates roughly to boy love, but even that is a misleading oversimplification. It was a formal, institutionalized relationship between an adult male citizen, the Eros the lover, and an adolescent boy, the Eromenos the beloved. This was not some hidden, back alley affair. It was an open, socially acknowledged, and, in some circles, idealized form of mentorship. The groom from our wedding story, now in his late 20s or 30s, might very well be an Eros to a boy, say, 16. The theory behind it was educational and civic. The older man, the Eros, was supposed to be a model of virtue for the youth. He would introduce the boy to public life, teach him about politics, philosophy, and courage. He was meant to be a mentor, guiding the boy's transition from adolescence to full manhood and citizenship. The physical, erotic component of the relationship was seen as a part of this mentorship, a way to inspire the boy and bind him to his teacher through a powerful bond of Philia and Eros. The ideal Eromenos, the beloved boy, was supposed to be modest, virtuous, and beautiful as beauty. Remember, Kalokogathia was the outward sign of his potential for greatness. He was not supposed to be passionate or desirous in return. The ideal was for him to be respectfully distant, to grant his favors reluctantly. Only after being convinced of the older man's noble character and honorable intentions. To appear too eager or to enjoy the physical aspect too much would be a mark of shame, suggesting a passive or unmanly nature. It was a delicate, high-stakes performance of virtue for the boy. You can see this dynamic celebrated on countless vase paintings. An older, bearded Eros thus offering a gift, a hare, a rooster, a lyre, to a beautiful, beardless youth. The gift is a formal part of the courtship. The man pursues. The boy demurs. The entire system was built around a power imbalance. Act 2. Pursuing citizen versus passive. Receptive non-citizen, as yous were not yet full citizens. And here is a very specific, and slightly odd, cultural detail. The timing was everything. The relationship was only considered appropriate during a specific window of the boy's life, after puberty had begun, but before he grew a full beard. The first fuzz on the cheek, the lan-yu-geo, was often described by poets as the peak of a boy's beauty. Once he could grow a proper beard, he was considered a man. At that point, continuing the relationship in the same role would be disgraceful for him. He was expected to graduate, to become a citizen, marry a woman, produce heirs, and, if he chose, become an Eros himself, mentoring a new generation. Of course, this was the ideal. The reality was likely much messier. The philosopher Plato spends a great deal of time trying to elevate this relationship, arguing that the truest form of paiderastia should be purely intellectual and spiritual. A platonic love that uses the boy's physical beauty as a stepping stone to contemplate the divine form of beauty itself. The fact that he had to argue so hard for this non-physical versions suggests that for most people, the physical aspect was very much present. This leads to a major point of contention for historians. How much of this was genuinely about mentorship and how much was it just a socially acceptable framework for exploitation? The line between education and abuse, from our modern perspective, seems incredibly thin, if not non-existent. Some scholars, focusing on the philosophical texts, argue for the system's noble, civic intentions, portraying it as a vital part of Athenian education. Others, looking at the coarser humor in comedies and the legal speeches prosecuting abuses of the system, argue that it was often a brutal reality of power dynamics where the consent and well-being of the boy were, at best, a secondary concern. The truth is likely somewhere in the murky middle, varying wildly from one relationship to another. It was a system that held the potential for both genuine guidance and terrible harm. As you stand in the shade of a column, watching a bearded man, earnestly speaking to a youth, you realize that the Greeks had compartmentalized love and desire in ways that are deeply alien. A man's life was split. His life was for heirs, the oikos. His eromenos was for education, status, and a specific kind of erotic and social fulfillment. But where did they get these ideas? For that, you only need to look up, to Mount Olympus. So, you are standing in this world where men's lives are neatly divided. A wife for heirs, a boy for mentorship. And you have to wonder, where did they get the blueprint for such a complexity? To you, contradictory emotional life. The answer is not written in a law book or a philosophical treatise. It is written in the stars, in the stories they tell about the beings who live on Mount Olympus. To understand the Greek heart, you have to understand their gods. And the first thing to get straight is that the Greek gods are not role models. Eros, forget the idea of a benevolent, all-knowing, morally perfect deity. The Olympians are a dysfunctional family of superpower, immortal beings with the emotional maturity of petulant teenagers. They are vain, jealous, lustful, and endlessly meddlesome. They do not set a standard for human morality. They provide a cosmic precedent for human chaos. Their lives are the ultimate drama. and their favorite pastime is interfering in the lives of mortals. At the head of this chaotic family is Zeus, the king of the gods, the lord of thunder and sky, and his most famous quality is not his wisdom or his justice. It is his utterly uncontrollable libido. Zeus is a serial predator. His mythology is essentially a long list of his affairs, which he conducts almost exclusively through deception, disguise, and outright assault. He came to Leda as a swan, to Europa as a majestic white bull, to Danae as a shower of golden rain. He does not court, he tricks. He does not persuade, he overwhelms. For the average Greek man, this divine example is incredibly powerful. If the king of all creation, the most powerful being in the universe, is completely helpless in the face of Eros, what chance does a mere mortal have? It frames desire not as a personal choice or a moral failing, but as a form of divine madness, a force that seizes you. When a man is overcome with lust, he can, in a way, shrug and say, "What can I do?" Even Zeus himself is a slave to this. It is the ultimate cosmic get-out-of-jail-free card. And it is not just Zeus. His wife, Hera, the goddess of marriage, is defined by her rage and jealousy. She does not just get angry. She becomes a terrifying, destructive force, relentlessly persecuting her husband's lovers and their children. Aphrodite, the goddess of love and beauty, has a long-running, scandalous affair with Ares, the brutal god of war. Their love is not a gentle romance. It is a fiery, adulterous passion that even the other gods gossip about. Even Apollo, the god of reason, music, and light, is shown pursuing the nymph Daphne so relentlessly that she begs to be turned into a laurel tree just to escape him. The message is clear. No one, not even the gods of order and reason, is immune to the madness of desire. Now, here is a specific and crucial piece of divine mythology that provided the ultimate justification for the practice of paideia we just discussed. The story is of Ganymede, a Trojan prince who was said to be the most beautiful of all mortals. Zeus, captivated by his beauty, transformed into an eagle, swooped down from the heavens, and abducted the boy. He carried him up to Mount Olympus to be his personal cupbearer. In most interpretations, his lover, this act, committed by the king of the gods himself, became the divine prototype for the relationship between an Aristescent and Eromenos. It sanctified the older man's desire for a beautiful youth, framing it as an appreciation of divine beauty, worthy of the gods themselves. This brings us to a huge, ongoing debate among classicists and historians of religion. How did the ancient Greeks actually view these stories? It is a question that is far from settled. Did they believe these myths as literal, historical truth? The answer is complicated. Some certainly did. For them, Zeus was real. His affairs were historical events. And Ganymede really was on Olympus sporing nectar. For these people, the myths were a direct charter for how the world worked. Others, especially the more philosophical types, saw them as allegories. Zeus's affairs were not literal events but symbolic stories about the relationship between the divine and the mortal, or representations of natural phenomena. A later school of thought, known as Erohimerism, even argued that the gods were originally just great human kings and heroes from the distant past whose stories were embellished over generations until they became divine. So, Zeus was once just a powerful king on the island of Crete. The most likely answer is that it was a mix of all of these things. The myths were a flexible and vital part of the culture. They could be taken as gospel, interpreted as metaphor, or simply enjoyed as thrilling, entertaining, and often scandalous stories. They were the shared cultural database that everyone knew. So, when a man gathered with his friends, reclining on a couch with a cup of wine in his hand, these tales of divine misbehavior were the bedrock of his conversation, his humor, and his understanding of his own impulses. And that is exactly where you are headed next. Into the smoky, wine-scented, and exclusively male domain of the party. The sun has set, casting long, purple shadows over the city. You follow your host, not into a rowdy public tavern, but into the most important room in his house for socializing, the undrawn. This is the men's dining room, and tonight, it is the setting for a symposium. Now, erase the modern image of a symposium as a dry academic conference. The Greek symposium, which literally means drinking together, is part political salon, part philosophical debating society, and part raucous party. It is the beating heart of Athenian male culture. The room is arranged with 7 to 15 couches. The clinei lining the walls. The guests, all male citizens of similar social standing, arrive and are given garlands of ivy or flowers to wear on their heads. They take off their sandals before reclining on the couches, usually to a couch, propped up on their left elbows. Slaves move quietly through the room, washing their hands and serving the first course of the evening. The food. This part is relatively sober and quick. The real event begins after the tables are cleared. This is when the drinking starts, and it is a highly ritualized affair. First, a libation. A small amount of unmixed wine is poured out and offered to the gods, a prayer for a good evening. Then, a symposia RCH, or master of the drinking, is elected from among the guests. This is a crucial role. He is the party's designated driver, so to speak. But for intoxication, he decides the strength of the wine and the pace of the drinking. And here is a fundamental rule you need to know about Greek drinking culture. They almost never drink their wine neat. To drink wine undiluted a kraton was considered the height of barbarism, a habit of uncivilized tribes like the Scythians. It suggested a lack of self-control. Instead, the wine was always mixed with water, usually in a large, ornate ceramic bowl called a crater. The symposia RCH would decide the mixing ratio. A common mix might be 3 parts water to 1 part wine. For a long night of conversation, a stronger mix of 1 to 1 might be for a more festive, less intellectual evening. His job was to get everyone to the same pleasant level of intoxication, to foster a sense of communal cheer without letting things descend into drunken chaos. With the wine mixed, the cups, beautifully painted, shallow bowls called KY lights, are filled, and the entertainment begins. This is not just idle chatter. A symposium could feature serious philosophical debate, with guests taking turns to deliver speeches on a set topic, like the nature of love, as in Plato's famous dialogue, The Symposium. Or it could be a night of poetry, with guests reciting verses from Homer or composing their own impromptu poems. Music is essential. Someone might play the lyre, a stringed instrument, but the most common sound is the high, piercing melody of the aulos, a double reed pipe. The woman playing this instrument is the oleri, a professional musician, and this is where the female presence at the party gets complicated. Respectable wives are, of course, nowhere to be seen, but the entertainment often included hired female professionals. These could be the all-ladies flute girls, dancers, or acrobats. They were not citizen women. They were typically slaves or foreigners, skilled entertainers hired for the evening, and their role could often blur the lines between artistic performance and sexual availability. Here is a bizarre and popular symposium game that gives you a sense of the mood. It is called Carte Bus. After draining his cup of wine, a guest would hold the calyx by one handle, swirl it to gather the last few dregs of wine at the bottom, and then, with a flick of the wrist, fling the dregs across the room at a target. The target could be a small bronze disc balanced on a stand, which would clang satisfied you've hit, or even a saucer floating in a basin of water, which the player would try to sink. It was a game of skill that required a steady hand. Even after a few cups of wine, they would often dedicate their throw to a person they admired, shouting their name. "This is for you, Le Gros," as they flung the wine. It was a silly, messy, and very popular way to pass the hours. But as the wine flows and the night wears on, the atmosphere can change. The philosophical debate can give way to bawdy songs, the elegant poetry to drunken arguments, the formalized courtship rituals of the date, and dissolve into more overt expressions of desire. The symposium is a space where the strict rules of the city are relaxed. It is a world within a world, governed by wine, poetry, and the will of the symposiar ch. And it is in this charged atmosphere that you might meet a very different kind of woman. Not a wife, not a flute girl, but a woman who could recline on a couch alongside the men. A woman who could match them in wit and conversation. She is a hetaira, amidst the race, the wine, and the echo of the cut a buzz splash. You notice her. She is not hiding in the shadows or serving the drinks. She is reclining on a couch, just like the man. She is engaged in the conversation. Her laughter is confident, and her witty remarks are met with genuine admiration, not surprise. She is not a wife. She is not a slave. And she is certainly not a low-level prostitute. She is a hetero, and she is perhaps the most socially complex and fascinating female figure in all of ancient Greece. The word hetero literally translates to companion, and that is the core of her role. She is a professional companion to the wealthy and powerful men of the city. But this title does not do justice to the scope of her skills. Unlike the cloistered citizen wives, a hetero was oft unhighly educated. She could read, write, play multiple musical instruments, and hold her own in conversations about politics, art, and philosophy. She was a master of rhetoric and wit. In a society that denied formal education to its respectable women, the hetera offered men something their wives never could: intellectual companionship. She cultivated her mind as much as her body. She was an expert in the art of pleasing, which included not just physical intimacy, but also the ability to create a charming, stimulating, and entertaining atmosphere. When a powerful man hosted a symposium, he might hire a hetera to ensure the conversation flowed. The mood stayed light, and his guests were thoroughly impressed. She was, in a sense, a professional hostess, a cultural facilitator, and a status symbol all in one. To have a beautiful, intelligent, and famous hetera at your party, or better yet, as your long-term companion, was a sign of immense wealth and sophistication. Their names have come down to us through history, which is remarkable in itself, as most individual women were erased from the public record. You hear stories of Aspasia of Miletus, the most famous of them all. She was a foreigner from the city of Miletus, which was known for producing educated women. She became the long-term partner of Pericles, the great Athenian statesman. The writers of the time, from Plato to the comic playwrights, all talk about her. They say she was so brilliant that men like Socrates would go to her for instruction in the art of public speaking. She ran a salon that was a center of Athenian intellectual life. Here is a curious tidbit that illustrates their unique position. Hetaira, I were the only women in Athens who were legally required to pay taxes. This might sound like a burden, but it was also a form of state recognition. It acknowledged their profession and their income, integrating them into the economic fabric of the city in a way that citizen wives, who had no independent income, were not. It set them apart, marking them as independent economic agents. But their lives were lived on a knife's edge. They had a degree of freedom and influence that was unthinkable for a citizen wife, but they had almost no security. Their career depended entirely on their beauty, their wit, and the favor of powerful men. An aging Hetaira, or one who fell out of favor, could find herself destitute. They could not marry a citizen. Their children, no matter who the father was, could never be Athenian citizens. They were forever outsiders, living in a gilded cage of admiration and precarity. This unique status creates a fascinating puzzle for historians, and the debate rages on. Were the Hetaira a powerful, independent women, the ancient equivalent of feminists who carved out a space for female intellect and agency in a patriarchal world? Or were they simply a more refined and expensive category of sex worker, ultimately still subject to the desires and whims of men, their freedom just an illusion that served male interests? The truth, as is often the case, is probably a complex blend of both. They were undeniably more privileged and educated than almost any other women in their society. Figures like Aspasia clearly wielded real influence. Yet, their livelihood was fundamentally transactional and depended on their ability to please men. They were exceptions that proved the rule of a deeply patriarchal society. While the Hetaira might charm the city's elite in the lamplight of a symposium, her existence was a world away from the women who plied a much more straightforward trade in the city's darker corners. As you leave the refined atmosphere of the undrawn, the scent of expensive perfume fading behind you, you step back into the common streets. And it is here, in the shadows of the port and the alleyways behind the market, that you find her less fortunate sisters in the trade. The refined laughter of the symposium fades into the distance, replaced by the low hum of the city at night. You leave the wealthy residential quarters and walk towards the bustling port of Piraeus or the crowded alleyways behind the Agora. The air here is thicker, smelling of fish, cheap wine, and unwashed bodies. This is the other side of the Athenian night. Here, you will not find witty conversation or philosophical debate. You will find the most basic and brutal form of transaction, and the women who perform it are called pornei. The word pornei, the singular of porne, is where we get our modern words prostitution and pornography. Unlike the sophisticated Hetaira, the pornei was at the very bottom of the social ladder. She was almost always a slave, often a captured foreigner or an abandoned child raised in a brothel. She had no freedom, no rights, and no choice in her profession. Her body belonged to her owner, the pornobushkoes, or brothel keeper. Their place of work was the pornaion, the brothel. These were not lavish establishments. You would find them in the seedier parts of the city, often marked by a simple, unambiguous sign, "Forget red lights." The symbol to look for was an erect phallus, sometimes painted above the door or represented by a lamp. It was a clear, unmistakable advertisement. Inside, the conditions were likely grim. Small, windowless rooms, a simple mat on the floor, and a constant rotation of customers. The price for a pornei was notoriously low. A man could purchase her services for as little as 1 obol, which was 1/6 of a drachma. To put that in perspective, a skilled laborer might earn about 1 drachma for a full day's work. This meant that even the poorest citizen, the rowers, the construction workers, the farmers, could afford a visit to a brothel. Prostitution was not seen as a moral failing for the man. It was viewed as a simple, necessary outlet for male desire, a way to maintain social order by providing an outlet that did not threaten the sanctity of a citizen's marriage. Here is a small, sad detail that humanizes these anonymous women. Archaeologists have found ancient graffiti scrawled on the walls of what are believed to be brothels or taverns where pornei worked. These are not grand inscriptions, but simple notes like "am wire tail is beautiful" or "priceless" next to a woman's name. But some of the most poignant finds are ancient bronze or lead tokens, discovered in various parts of the Greek world. These tokens, often called sphentrae by later Roman collectors, depicted an explicit act on one side and a number on the other. The prevailing theory is that these were brothel tokens. A customer would pay at the front desk, receive a token depicting the service he had paid for, and then give it to the woman, who could later redeem it with her owner for a small portion of the earnings or perhaps just as proof of the transaction. It was a system that reduced the most intimate of human acts to a cold, metallic currency. The life of a pornee was brutal and often short. She was subject to violence, disease, and constant exploitation. Yet, the state itself was complicit in this system. Athens levied a tax on brothels, making the city a direct beneficiary of the trade. The law gave her Solon, back in the 6th century BCE, was credited with being the first to establish state-run brothels. The rationale, according to the ancient writers, was to protect respectable women and boys from the aggressive desires of young men by creating a designated, affordable outlet. The city could channel male Eros away from the wrong targets. This brings us to a complex question that historians of gender and society still actively debate. Did this system of state-regulated prostitution actually protect respectable women, as the ancient male writers claimed? Or did it simply reinforce the extreme on-a-horde dichotomy of the Greek world, creating a system where one class of women was made utterly disposable for the supposed honor of another? Some argue it was a pragmatic, if brutal, solution to a social reality. Others contend it was a cornerstone of the patriarchal system, creating a permanent underclass of women whose degradation was the necessary price for the citizen wife's chastity and the stability of the oikos. The system was not a byproduct of Greek society. It was a pillar holding it up. So you have the secluded, honored wife, you have the brilliant, precarious hetero, and you have the enslaved, anonymous pornee. It seems like a complete, if deeply unequal, picture of the female experience. But it is missing something. All of these roles are defined by their relationship to men. What about the relationships women had with each other? For a glimpse of that, you have to leave the mainland entirely. You have to set sail for an island in the Aegean, an island that would give its name to a form of love that the men of Athens rarely spoke of. You board a ship, the salty spray of the Aegean mist in your face, and leave the noisy, masculine world of Athens behind. Your destination is Lesbos, a lush, green island famous for its wine, its poetry, and for one woman whose voice has echoed through the millennia, even though only fragments of her work survive. Her name is Sappho. Stepping onto the island, around 600 BC, you find a world with a different texture. While still a patriarchal Greek society, the aristocratic women of Lesbos seem to enjoy a greater degree of freedom and education than their counterparts in Athens. They are not living in strict seclusion. They gather, they learn, and they create. And at the center of this world is Sappho, a poet of immense renown. In her own time, she was not a controversial figure. She was a superstar. Plato called her the 10th muse. People inscribed her verses on pottery. She was considered one of the greatest lyric poets of all time. She appears to have run something like a school or a collective, a theasos, for young, unmarried upper-class women. Here, they were educated in the arts of grace and beauty, music, dance, poetry, and personal charm, in preparation for their eventual marriages. It was a finishing school, of a sort, a place where girls would spend a few years before being married off to men, often from other cities. Sappho was their teacher, their mentor, and the emotional heart of this circle. And it is in the poetry she wrote for and about these girls that we get our only real glimpse into the inner emotional world of women ancient Greece. Her poems are not grand epics about war and gods. They are intensely personal, intimate, and filled with a burning, heartfelt emotion. She writes about the beauty of a particular girl, the pain of her departure for marriage, the jealousy she feels when she sees another woman talking to a girl she loves. In one of her most famous surviving fragments, she describes the physical symptoms of her love in a way that feels shockingly modern and raw. She writes of seeing the object of her affection. My tongue is broken. A thin flame runs under my skin. I see nothing with my eyes. My ears are humming. A cold sweat covers me, and a trembling seizes me all over. This is not a detached philosophical concept of Eros. This is a visceral, physiological, overwhelming experience. It is the voice of pure, personal passion. It is from her name, Sappho, and the name of her island, Lesbos, that we derive the modern terms sapphic and lesbian. But applying these modern identity labels to her is complicated. Did Sappho's circle involve physical relationships between the women? The poems are filled with passionate, homoerotic language, but they are frustratingly ambiguous about whether this love was physically consummated. This is the central question that has fueled centuries of the Sappho problem among scholars. For a long time, particularly in the 19th and early 20th centuries, many male classicists went to great lengths to descandalize her. They argued that her love was purely pedagogical and maternal, that the passionate language was just a conventional, poetic way for a teacher to express affection for her students. They tried to paint her as a respectable, chaste head mistress of a girls' school. Here is a bizarre and slightly comical example of this historical revisionism. One ancient legend, likely invented by later comic playwrights in Athens who were uncomfortable with her reputation, claimed that Sappho died by leaping off a cliff into the sea because of her unrequited love for a man, a ferryman named Phal. It is a story with no historical basis, likely created to impose a proper heterosexual narrative onto her life. Today, most scholars accept and celebrate the homoerotic nature of her poetry. The debate is no longer about if her poems describe love between women, but about how to understand that love in its own context. Was this a temporary, socially acceptable phase in a girl's life before she fulfilled her duty to marry a man? Was it a subculture that existed parallel to the patriarchal mainstream? Or was it something else entirely? We are left with tantalizing fragments, a puzzle with most of the pieces missing. We hear her powerful voice, but we cannot fully reconstruct the world it came from. The debate over the exact nature of life in Sappho's circle is one of the most enduring mysteries in the study of the ancient world. So while the men of Athens were busy with their symposia and their paid Eristia, a different world of love and desire existed on Lesbos, once entered on female experience and expressed in female voices. It is a vital reminder that the Athenian model was not the only one. And speaking of different models, there is another city-state, a rival to Athens, where the rules of love, sex, and society were so radically different they might as well have been on another planet. It is time to take a trip to the stark, militaristic world of Sparta. Leave the poetic air of Lesbos and the philosophical chatter of Athens. You are now on a forced march south, into the rugged, landlocked valley of Laconia. The landscape feels harsher, more disciplined. You have arrived in Sparta, and if you thought Athens was a strange and rigid society, you have not seen anything yet. Sparta is not a city-state in the way Athens is. It is a military barracks with a city attached. Every single aspect of life here, every law, every custom, every relationship, is subordinated to one ultimate goal: the creation of the perfect warrior. From the moment a Spartan baby is born, its life is in the hands of the state. Elders of the tribe would inspect the infant. If it was deemed weak, sickly, or disordered, it was taken to a chasm near Mount Taygetus and left to die. This was not seen as cruel. It was a pragmatic necessity. The state could not afford to waste resources on a citizen who could not contribute to its military strength. Survival of the fittest was not a theory here. It was public policy. If a boy was deemed fit, his life was set on a singular, brutal path. At the age of 7, he was taken from his family and entered into the Agoge, the state-run military training program that would consume the next 2 decades of his life. He lived in a barracks with his age group, subjected to relentless physical training, deprivation, and discipline. He was taught to endure pain, hunger, and cold without complaint. The goal was to strip away his individuality and forge him into a loyal, unquestioning cog in the Spartan war machine. Within this all-male, intensely competitive environment, relationships between older warriors and younger trainees were not just common. They were institutionalized, much like in Athens, but with a distinctly Spartan flavor. It was a form of mentorship designed to instill courage and loyalty. A young boy would be paired with a decorated older warrior, who was responsible for his training and conduct. This bond was expected to be powerful, and most ancient sources agree it had an erotic component. The idea was that a soldier would fight more fiercely to protect and impress his beloved. The legendary sacred band of Thebes, an elite unit of 150 pairs of male lovers, was the most famous example of this principle put into practice, and it was a model the Spartans understood well. Now, what about the girls? Here's where Sparta diverges radically from Athens. While the Athenian girl was hidden away, learning to weave, the Spartan girl was out in the open. She was also part of a state-supervised education system. She was trained in gymnastics, wrestling, discus, and javelin. She exercised, often nude in minimal clothing, alongside the boys. The Athenians were scandalized by this. They called Spartan women thigh flashers. But for the Spartans, it was logical. The primary duty of a Spartan woman was to produce strong Spartan sons. Therefore, she needed to be strong and healthy herself. A fit body would produce fit babies. This leads to a truly bizarre Spartan marriage custom. A man was expected to marry around the age of 30, but he continued to live in the barracks with his fellow soldiers until he was much older. His marriage was, for years, a clandestine affair. On his wedding night, the bride would have her head shaved, be dressed in a man's cloak and sandals, and be left alone in a darkened room. The groom would sneak away from his barracks, spend a short time with her, and then sneak back before his comrades noticed he was gone. This ritual of marriage by abduction and stealth would continue for years. The couple would meet only in secret, at night. The purpose, according to the historian Plutarch, was to keep their passion high and to ensure that when they did meet, it was for the vigorous purpose of conception. Here is another strange detail of Spartan life. They did not use gold or silver currency. They used iron rods, heavy and of little intrinsic value, called dobi eloi. The idea was to discourage the accumulation of wealth and luxury, which were seen as corrupting influences that made men soft. This made everything, from buying food to paying a dowry, incredibly cumbersome. It was a society that actively rejected the comforts and refinements that Athens celebrated. This starkly different approach to life leads to a major historical debate. Were Spartan women truly more liberated than their Athenian sisters? On the one hand, they were educated, physically active, and could own and inherit property in their own right, giving them significant economic power, because their husbands were so often away at war or living in the barracks. Spartan women ran the estates and managed the households with a degree of autonomy unheard of in Athens. They were famously outspoken and confident. On the other hand, this freedom was still entirely in service to the state's eugenic and military goals. A woman's worth was still measured by her womb. Her education was not for her own intellectual fulfillment, but to make her a better breeder of warriors. There are even accounts of wife sharing, where a man might be encouraged to lend his wife to a more physically impressive man to produce a superior child, with the offspring being credited to the husband. So, was it liberation or a different form of state-controlled servitude? Historians are deeply divided, with some hailing the Spartan women as proto-feminist icons and others seeing them as broodmothers for a totalitarian state, while Spartan women exercised in the open, and Athenian women were cloistered in their homes. Both were still largely excluded from one of the most important aspects of Greek life, the official, public religious festivals. Or were they? In the shadows of the mainstream patriarchal religion, women had their own powerful, mysterious, and strictly secret rituals, and you are about to get a glimpse into one of them. You have to be quiet now. Very quiet. Leave the disciplined world of Sparta and the intellectual hum of Athens. You are sneaking through the countryside, under the cover of an autumn night. You are approaching the sanctuary. But there are no men here, no soldiers, no philosophers, no husbands. The air is thick with the smell of roasting pig, damp earth, and something else, a kind of sacred secrecy. You are about to witness the Smophoroi, one of the most important and mysterious all-female religious festivals in the ancient Greek world. This multi-day festival was held in honor of the goddess Demeter, the goddess of the harvest and agriculture, and her daughter, Persephone, the queen of the underworld. It was a celebration of the human and agricultural fertility cycle, and it was strictly, absolutely, for citizen wives only. Any man who was caught even accidentally witnessing the rites could be put to death. The playwright Aristophanes wrote a comedy, the Smophoroi is a USA, where a man tries to infiltrate the festival disguised as a woman, and the plot revolves around the hilarious and dangerous consequences of his discovery. The festival was tied to the myth of Demeter and Persephone. The story goes that Persephone was abducted by Hades, the god of the underworld. Her mother, Demeter, was so overcome with grief that she neglected her duties, and the earth became barren. Nothing would grow, to prevent humanity from starving. Zeus brokered a deal. Persephone would spend part of the year in the underworld with her husband, Hades representing winter, and part of the year on earth with her mother representing the spring and summer growing season. The Smophoroi reenacted and celebrated this entire cycle of loss, grief, and joyful reunion. On the first day, the women would set up a temporary encampment near a sanctuary of Demeter. They would build shelters and prepare for the days ahead. This was a rare moment of female solidarity and community. a chance to escape the confines of the oikos and the authority of their husbands. For a few days, they created their own self-governing society. The central and most mysterious ritual occurred on the second day, which was a day of fasting and mourning. Designated women, who had to be ritually pure, would descend into sacred pits or chasms in the earth. Down in the darkness, they would retrieve the decayed remains of piglets that had been thrown into the pits months earlier, along with other symbols of fertility like pine cones and dough-shaped into phallic symbols. This act of bringing up the decayed, organic matter was deeply symbolic. The decomposed pigs represented the death and decay necessary for new life, just like seeds dying in the earth before they can sprout. Here is a truly strange and visceral detail of the ritual. The put-ray-feed remains of the piglets were then brought up, mixed with seeds, and placed on the altar. This mixture was considered a powerful magical fertilizer. Farmers could later take a small amount of this consecrated mixture and sprinkle it on their fields, believing it would guarantee a bountiful harvest. It was a potent combination of organic decay, divine blessing, and agricultural magic. The third day was called Kali Ginai, the day of Fairburn. The mood shifted from mourning to celebration. The women would break their fast, feast likely on the pork that had been sacrificed, and engage in what the ancient male sources describe as eyes crow ogia, ritual obscenity. They would shout insults, tell bawdy jokes, and handle the dough models of genitals. This was not just drunken revelry. Scholars believe this ritual impurity unverbal filth was a form of sympathetic magic. The idea was that by engaging in behavior associated with unbridled life and fertility, they would magically shock the earth and the goddess back into a state of productivity. It was a way of shouting life back into the dormant fields. This leads to the enduring historical mystery of the S3X, because men were forbidden, and the women who participated were bound by secrecy. We have no direct accounts of what truly happened. Everything we know comes from second-hand male sources, like the Christian writers who described it to condemn it, or the comic playwrights who satirized it. They give us the outlines, but they almost certainly miss the nuances and the true spiritual meaning for the women involved. What did the women actually talk about during those days? What were the jokes they told? What were the prayers they whispered? Did they simply perform the rites? Or was this a time for sharing frustrations, building networks of support, and exercising a form of female power that was denied to them in everyday life? Some historians argue it was purely a religious ritual focused on agriculture. Others see it as a powerful, subversive carnival, a temporary overthrow of the patriarchal order where women could assert their own authority and celebrate their own crucial role in the survival of the state. We can only speculate about what was said in the firelight of that secret encampment. For these few days, the women held the keys to the city's prosperity in their hands. But once the festival was over, they returned to their homes, to their husbands, and to the strict laws of the polis. And those laws had very clear, and very different, punishments for men and women who violated the sanctity of marriage. The sacred jokes of the DSM have faded, and you are back within the high walls of the Athenian oikos. The brief, sanctioned escape is over. The wife has returned to her role, a role defined by one paramount virtue: absolute fidelity. Her chastity is not just a personal matter. It is the bedrock of the entire social and political system. Why? Because the legitimacy of heirs depended on it. A man had to be certain that the son who would inherit his name, his property, and his citizenship was truly his own. An unfaithful wife did not just betray her husband. She threatened the very fabric of the city by potentially introducing a cuckoo's egg into the nest, an illegitimate child who could fraudulently claim citizen rights. because the stakes were so high. The punishment for a wife's adultery was swift and severe. The law in Athens gave the husband, the kyrios, extraordinary power if he caught his wife in the act with another man. According to a law attributed to Draco, the husband had the legal right to kill the adulterer on the spot, without fear of prosecution. This was not vigilante justice. It was his state-sanctioned right. It was considered a justifiable homicide. As one orator put it, the lawgiver believed that a man who corrupts a citizen's wife has committed a crime against the entire city. If the husband chose not to kill the man, he was still legally obligated to divorce his wife immediately. To knowingly continue living with an adulterous wife was to lose his own rights as a citizen. He was shamed publicly. The woman herself was cast out. She was barred from attending public sacrifices and festivals, a profound social and religious excommunication. If she tried to enter a temple, anyone had the right to strip her of her clothes and jewelry and beat her, as long as they did not kill her. She became a social pariah, a non-person. Her life as a respectable member of society was over. Now, what about the husband? What was the price for his infidelity? Here, you see the breathtaking double standard of the Greek world laid bare. A husband having sex with a slave, a prostitute pornée, or even a foreign concubine was not considered adultery. It was just a Tuesday. It was seen as a normal, expected part of male behavior. As we have seen, the city itself provided outlets for this. His actions had no bearing on the legitimacy of his own household, so they were of no legal concern to the state. The only time a man's affair became a legal issue was if he had sex with another citizen's wife, daughter, or sister who was under the protection of a male kyrios. And even then, the crime was not seen as one of infidelity against his own wife. The crime was against the other man. He had trespassed on another man's property. He had violated the honor and compromised the bloodline of another oikos. The wronged husband in that case had the same right to kill the offender or demand a hefty fine. The man's own wife had no legal standing to complain about his affairs. Her feelings were irrelevant to the law. Here is a peculiar legal nuance that highlights this property-based view. The law made a distinction between seduction and assault. If a man forced himself upon a married woman, the penalty was a fine. But if he seduced her, if he persuaded her to be unfaithful, the penalty was much harsher, potentially even death. Why? The logic, as explained by the orator Lysias, was that a man who uses force violates a woman's body, but a man who uses seduction corrupts her soul. The seducer enters the home, gains the wife's trust, and potentially confuses the lineage of the children. He steals the husband's authority and affection within his own home. This was seen as a far more dangerous and insidious crime against the oikos. This legal framework leaves us with a question that legal and social historians still puzzle over. How often was the justifiable homicide law actually invoked? Was it common for husbands to kill their wives' lovers? Or was it a rare and extreme event? The court speeches we have from the period often feature men defending their actions by claiming they were upholding this law. But are these speeches reliable evidence? Some scholars argue that these were probably real, if dramatic, cases. Others suggest that the "I caught him in the act" offense might have been a convenient legal fiction, a way for a man to get away with murdering a personal enemy and then claiming the legal justification of adultery after the fact. We have the law, but we do not know for sure how it played out in the bloody reality of the moment. So, the consequences of a forbidden act work clear and terrifyingly unequal. But what if you did not want the act to have consequences? What if you wanted the pleasure, but not the child that might result from it? The Greeks, like all people throughout history, looked for ways to control their own fertility, and their methods were a fascinating and sometimes frightening mix of folk wisdom, rudimentary science, and pure magic. You are back in the private, hidden spaces of the Greek world, the women's quarters, the back rooms of a Eros house, the hushed conversations between a husband and wife, the fear of an illegitimate birth, an unwanted child, or a pregnancy at the wrong time was a constant, looming anxiety. And so, the ancient Greeks developed a whole arsenal of contraceptive and abortifacient methods, a strange and hopeful pharmacopoeia drawn from the natural world around them. Their understanding of reproductive biology was, to be blunt, a bit of a mess. The dominant theory, championed by thinkers like Aristotle, was that the man provided the form or the seed sperma, while the woman provided the matter, the fertile ground of the womb in which the seed would grow. The man was the active, creative force. The woman was the passive vessel. This belief system placed the power and responsibility for creation squarely with the male. However, on a practical, day-to-day level, it was the women who were largely responsible for managing the consequences. Their methods were a mix of the quasi-scientific and the wildly superstitious. One of the most common approaches was coitus interruptus, the withdrawal method. It is as old as humanity, and the Greeks certainly knew about it and practiced it. It was free, required no special ingredients, but as they surely discovered, it was far from foolproof. For more tangible solutions, they turned to the plant world. Their most famous undefective tool was a plant that has become the stuff of legend, Sophium. This was a species of giant fennel that grew only along the narrow coastal strip of North Africa, near the Greek colony of Cyrene. Sophium was a miracle plant to the ancient world. They used its stalks as a vegetable, its roots as a perfume, and its sap as a medicine for everything from coughs to leprosy. But its most prized quality was as a powerful contraceptive and early term abortifacient. It was so effective and so valuable that the plant was stamped onto the coins of Cyrene. It literally was their currency. Women would drink the juice of the plant, or a peppercorn-sized amount of its resin. After intercourse, the demand was so high that they over-harvested it. The last stalk of Sophium was supposedly presented to the Roman Emperor Nero in the 1st century CE, and then it was gone forever. It was harvested into extinction. Here is a fascinating detail that shows just how deeply Sophium was associated with love and sex. Some scholars believe that the classic heart shape, the universal symbol of love, may have originated as a stylized drawing of the Sophium seed or seed pod. If you look at the depiction of the seed on ancient seer and young coins, the resemblance is uncanny. It is possible that every time you send a heart emoji, you are unknowingly referencing the ancient world's most effective contraceptive. With Sophium being rare and expensive, most people had to rely on other, less reliable herbs. They used penurial, queen anise lace, also known as wild carrot, and the seeds of the pomegranate. The pomegranate was strongly associated with Persephone and the underworld, a symbol of both death and fertility, making it a powerful choice for this kind of folk medicine. Women would make teas from these plants or use them as vaginal suppositories. Some of these herbs, like penurial, do contain compounds that can be toxic and induce miscarriage, but they are also dangerous and could easily harm or kill the woman taking them. It was a high-stakes gamble. Beyond botany, there were physical methods. The physicians Ornos of Ephesus, writing in the 2nd century CE, but drawing on much older Greek knowledge, gives a list of instructions for women. He advises that after intercourse, a woman should immediately get up, squat down, and induce a sneeze. The idea was that the force of the sneeze could expel the semen. He also recommended wiping out the vagina with a piece of wool or drinking something cold. And then there was magic. People would wear amulets, often made from stone or bone, with cryptic inscriptions. A particularly strange and common practice involved a magical stone taken from the womb of a she-mule, which, being a sterile animal, was believed to have contraceptive properties. A woman would wear this stone tied around her ankle or another part of her body. This reliance on a mix of plausible and magical methods leads to a persistent question for medical historians. How much of this actually worked? We know silphium was likely very effective, given its reputation and its extinction. Some of the other herbs may have had a limited effect, but many of the methods, like sneezing or wearing amulets, were based on faulty science or pure superstition. Yet, people clearly believed in them. The debate centers on the power of the placebo effect and the psychological need to feel some sense of control in a world of biological uncertainty. Did the amulet work because the woman wearing it felt less anxious in her body, responded accordingly? Or was it simply that most acts of intercourse do not result in pregnancy anyway, and people attributed their luck to the charm? These practices were about preventing a birth. But what about the nature of the desire that lead to the act in the first place? We have talked about relationships between men and women, and men and boys. But when we use a term like homosexuality to describe what happened in the gymnasium or on the island of Lesbos, we are imposing our own modern ideas onto a world that saw things very, very differently. You have seen the husband with his wife, the Eros with his Eromenos, Sappho with her girls. It is a dizzying array of relationships, and your modern brain keeps trying to slot them into neat categories. Straight, gay, bi, but you have to take those labels, fold them out, and put them away. They are useless here. In ancient Greece, these concepts of sexual identity simply did not exist. No one in Athens would have identified as a homosexual. It would have been a nonsensical statement. The key distinction for the Greeks was not the gender of your sexual partner. It was about your role in the sexual act, which was inextricably linked to your social status as a citizen. The defining axis was not same-sex versus opposite sex, but active versus passive. To be the active, dominant, penetrating partner was to be masculine and to affirm your status as a citizen. To be the passive, receptive, penetrated partner was considered unmanly, subservient, and, for a full-grown citizen man, deeply shameful. A citizen man was expected to be the doer, never the done to. This is the fundamental, non-negotiable rule of Greek masculinity. This is why the relationship between an adult male citizen and a pornee, a female prostitute, was perfectly acceptable. He was active. She was passive and of low status. This is also why the relationship between an Eros, an adult male citizen, and an Eromenos, a youth who was not yet a full citizen, was acceptable, within its strict social and temporal boundaries. The older man was active. The youth was, ideally, receptive but not passive in a debased way. His role was more complex, framed as part of his education. But for two adult, bearded, citizen status men to have a relationship where one of them consistently took the passive role, that was a source of immense social stigma and ridicule. The man who was perceived as enjoying being penetrated was seen as having abandoned his masculinity. He was called a china, eidos, or china eros in Latin, a deeply insulting term. He was seen as soft, and morally weak. In comedies, these men were caricatured as having high-pitched voices, wearing extravagant clothing, and being obsessed with their appearance. They were not condemned for desiring men. They were condemned for being like a woman and betraying their duty as a man. Here is a curious little legal fact that underscores this. In Athens, a citizen who worked as a male prostitute, that is, a man who allowed himself to be penetrated for money, lost his political rights. He was subject to edemia, a loss of honor. He could no longer speak in the public assembly, serve as a magistrate, or bring a lawsuit. Why? Because a man who would rent out his body in a passive role was considered to have given up his autonomy. If he could not even govern his own body, how could he be trusted to help govern the city? His crime was not a sexual one in our sense. It was a political one. The same logic applied, in a different way, to women. There was not a specific condemnatory term for a woman who loved other women in the same way there was for a passive man. As we saw with Sappho, relationships between women could be celebrated within certain contexts. However, a woman who was seen as taking the active or masculine role in a relationship with another woman could be an object of satire. The comic playwrights, always looking for a laugh, would sometimes mock the trib as a term for a woman who pursues other women, portraying her as unnaturally aggressive and usurping the male role. Again, the focus is on the transgression of gender roles, not on the gender of the partner. This is where we hit one of the great debates in the history of sexuality. Some historians, known as essentialistes, would argue that despite the different social frameworks, the fundamental human experience of same-sex desire is a constant throughout history. A man who loved men in ancient Athens felt, on a basic biological and emotional level, the same thing a gay man feels today. The social expression was different, but the essence was the same. On the other side are the social constructionists, who argue that this is a profound misunderstanding. They contend that desire itself is shaped by culture. An ancient Athenian man's Eros for a boy was a completely different psychological and social phenomenon from modern gay identity. It was structured by ideas of status, mentorship, and civic virtue that are completely alien to us. To call him gay is to rip him out of his context and fundamentally misinterpret his experience. This debate is far from over and gets to the heart of how we understand ourselves in the past. The Greeks did not write think pieces about their sexuality, but they did leave behind a vast, uninhibited, and sometimes shocking visual record of their desires. To see their world without the filter of philosophical ideals or legal texts, you just have to look at the everyday objects they drank from. It is time to become an archaeologist and read the stories on their pottery. You are no longer out in the city. You are in the quiet, climate-controlled backroom of a museum, or perhaps kneeling in the dirt of an archaeological dig. The dust of centuries is being brushed away. In your hands, you hold a fragment of a drinking cup, a calyx, or a piece of a wine-mixing bowl, a crater, and on this piece of fired clay is a snapshot, a frozen moment from the world you have just been exploring. The ancient Greeks did not just use their pottery for drinking. They used it as a canvas to depict their lives, their myths, and their most intimate desires, and they were not shy. As you piece the fragments together, a scene comes to life. It is painted in the characteristic red figure style, where the figures are the reddish color of the natural clay, set against a glossy black background. This technique allowed for incredible detail, and the artists used it to its full potential. The images on these vases are our most direct, unfiltered window into the visual culture of Greek sexuality. You will see scenes straight from the symposium. Men reclining on their couches, draped in garlands, playing kardebas. You can almost hear the music from the flute girl painted in the corner. But look closer at the interactions. You see an older, bearded Aristes presenting a gift to a youthful Eromenos. The youth's posture is often reserved, his gaze averted, perfectly performing the role of the modest beloved. In other scenes, the courtship is more advanced, a hand on the chin, a gentle touch. These are the idealized, textbook examples of paiderastia. But then you find other vases, the ones that were probably meant for a rodeo party. Here, the scenes are far more explicit. You see heterosexual encounters, often between a citizen man and a woman who is clearly not his wife. Her different hairstyle or clothing might mark her as a hetaira or a slave. The settings are casual, the interactions direct, and you see plenty of male-male encounters that leave little to the imagination. These scenes often take place in the palestra, the wrestling school, surrounded by athletic equipment like discuses or stray gills, the tool used to scrape oil off the body. The context of athleticism and male beauty is ever present. These images are not hidden or shameful. They are part of the standard decorative repertoire, casually placed on the very cups the men at the symposium would be drinking from. It is like having a beer koozie with an art history lesson on it. Here is a curious and specific detail you start to notice on many of these vases. When depicting heterosexual intercourse, the artists very often show the couple looking away from each other, their gazes averted. There is a notable lack of face-to-face intimacy. Some art historians interpret this as a reflection of the social distance between men and women, a visual representation of the lack of personal connection in many of these encounters, especially those with prostitutes. It was a physical act, not an emotional one. The sheer variety is staggering. You find scenes of mythic robes, like Zeus pursuing one of his many interests. You see comical scenes with clumsy, over-enthusiastic satyrs, the half-male, half-goat followers of Dionysus, chasing nymphs through the woods. The satyrs, with their exaggerated, permanently erect phalluses, represent pure, uninhibited, and slightly ridiculous male lust, a comical foil to the self-controlled ideal of the citizen man. But this incredible visual record presents a huge and hotly debated question for archaeologists and art historians. Who were these images for? And how were they read by their original audience? When a man at a symposium drank from a cup that revealed an explicit scene at the bottom as he drained his wine, was it meant to be arousing, a joke, a conversation starter, a warning, a celebration? Some scholars argue that these images are a fairly straightforward reflection of the social norms of the time. They are a what is what of the Greek sexual landscape, a visual catalog of the available options for a citizen male. They simply depict the world as it was. Other scholars argue that it is far more complicated. They suggest the images are not a mirror of reality, but a form of fantasy. They might depict an idealized version of relationships, or perhaps explore taboo subjects in the safe space of the symposium. The vase might be a place to depict things that were not necessarily common practice, but were part of the cultural imagination. For example, are the countless scenes of satyrs and nymphs a reflection of real desires, or are they more like an ancient form of cartoon comedy, meant to be laughed at for their absurdity? The debate over whether to interpret these images literally or symbolically is ongoing. These painted stories, these frozen moments of desire, give us the what. They show us the acts, the roles, and the settings, but they do not always give us the why. They do not explain the philosophy behind it all. For that, you have to leave the pottery shed and walk into a much more rarefied atmosphere. You have to listen in on a conversation being led by a man with a famously snub nose and a brilliant mind. A man who tried to elevate desire from the physical to the divine. Plato. You find yourself in a shaded olive grove on the outskirts of Athens, At a place called the Academy, the air is still and warm, filled with the buzzing of cicadas. There are no wine-splashed floors or raucous party games here. This is a place of quiet, intense conversation, and at the center of a group of earnest young men is a stout, not particularly handsome man with a brilliant, probing mind. Plato, you are here to audit the most influential philosophy class in Western history, and the topic of the day is love. Plato, speaking through his teacher, Socrates, is deeply troubled by the world you have just been exploring. He sees the raw, chaotic power of Eros, the kind celebrated in myths and depicted on vases, as a dangerous and distracting force. He believes that physical desire, the love for a single, beautiful body, is the lowest, most primitive rung on a long ladder. It is a starting point. But to stay, there is to miss the whole point of existence. You listen as he lays out his famous theory, the ladder of love. From his dialogue, The Symposium, he argues that a person's journey towards wisdom begins with the love of a single, beautiful body. This is the initial spark. A young man sees a beautiful boy Eromenas and is struck by desire. This is natural and necessary. But, Plato insists, the true philosopher cannot stop there. The next step on the ladder is to realize that the beauty in this one body is not unique. It shares a kinship with the beauty in all other beautiful bodies. So, the lover learns to appreciate physical beauty in a more general sense, moving from loving one person to loving the idea of physical beauty itself. He has climbed one rung. Then, the ladder takes a crucial turn away from the physical. The lover must learn to value the beauty of the soul more than the beauty of the body. A virtuous, intelligent soul, even if it resides in a less than perfect body, is far more worthy of love than a perfect body with a flawed soul. This is a radical idea in a culture so obsessed with kalokagothia. Plato is trying to sever the link between outer beauty and inner goodness. From loving a beautiful soul, the lover then ascends to loving the beauty of institutions and laws, the systems that create good souls. From there, he climbs higher still, to loving the beauty of knowledge and ideas, particularly science and mathematics. He is moving further into the realm of pure intellect. Finally, at the very top of the ladder, after a lifetime of disciplined philosophical ascent, the lover is granted a breathtaking vision. He beholds beauty itself, absolute, pure, and eternal. This is the divine form of beauty, the ultimate reality of which all beautiful things on earth are just pale, flickering shadows. This, for Plato, is the true goal of Eros. The love for a beautiful boy is not an end in itself. It is the fuel for a philosophical rocket ship designed to take you to the realm of the divine forms. This is the origin of what we now call platonic love. But as you can see, our modern definition, a deep, affectionate but non-sexual friendship, is a complete misunderstanding of what Plato meant. For Plato, the relationship was intensely erotic. The physical desire was the essential first stage, the engine of the whole process. His idea was not to eliminate Eros, but to channel it, to sublimate it, to use its powerful energy for a higher, philosophical purpose. A Platonic relationship, in Plato's original sense, is a passionate, erotic relationship where the lovers consciously decide to use their mutual desire as a springboard to contemplate abstract truth and achieve spiritual enlightenment. It is much weirder and more intense than just being friends. Here is a small, telling detail from Plato's writing. In the Symposium, the handsome and famously debauched politician Alcibiades crashes the party, drunk, and gives a speech confessing his love for Socrates. He describes how he tried, and failed, to seduce the older philosopher. hoping to exchange his physical beauty for Socrates' wisdom. Socrates completely rejected his advances. Alcibiades is left frustrated and confused, but also in awe of Socrates' incredible self-control. This story perfectly illustrates Plato's ideal. Socrates feels the pull of Eros, but he has mastered it and redirected it towards philosophy. This leads us to a debate that has occupied philosophers and historians for centuries. Did Plato genuinely believe this ladder of love was a practical guide for living? Was he describing a spiritual path that he and his followers actually tried to practice? Or was it a purely theoretical, utopian ideal? A philosophical poem designed to critique the messy reality of Athenian love lives without any expectation that people would actually live this way. Some scholars see the academy as a place where this kind of sublimated, philosophical love was the goal. Others argue that Plato was using the familiar language of paideristia to make a radical philosophical point, creating a beautiful but ultimately unreachable ideal. We do not know if anyone ever truly made it to the top of his ladder. Plato's ideas were profoundly influential, shaping Western thought about love, beauty, and the spirit for the next 2,000 years. But his was an elite, philosophical view. If you want to know what the average person in the street thought about love and sex, you do not go to the academy. You go to the theater. Take a seat on the hard stone benches, and get ready for some truly filthy jokes. All right, leave the high-minded, intellectual atmosphere of Plato's academy. The sun is beating down, and you are shuffling with a noisy crowd into the great open-air theater of Dionysus, built into the southern slope of the Acropolis. You have paid your ticket, maybe a couple of oboes, and you are finding a spot on the tiered stone seats. This is not a place for quiet contemplation. The air is buzzing with the energy of thousands of citizens, farmers, merchants, politicians, soldiers. This is the heart of popular entertainment, and you are here for the comedy. If Plato gives you the art, the idealized vision of love, the comic playwrights like Aristophanes give you the is. Their plays are a raucous, rude, and gloriously unfiltered look at what ordinary people were actually thinking, saying, and laughing about. And they were laughing about sex. Constantly. The actors on stage are wearing grotesque masks with exaggerated features and are heavily padded to look ridiculous. Most strikingly, the male characters in old comedy often wear huge leather phallus, the phallos, strapped around their waist, flopping around as they move. This is not meant to be subtle. It is a visual gag, a constant, in-your-face reminder of the body, Dionysian energy that underlies the festival. The plots of these comedies are wild, fantastical, and deeply topical. They are the ancient equivalent of a late night's satirical news show. They mock well-known politicians. Parody famous philosopher Socrates gets roasted mercilessly. And, most importantly for our journey, they drag every aspect of Athenian sexual life out into the open for public ridicule. Nothing is sacred. You watch a play like Aristophanes' Lysistrata. The premise is brilliant and simple. The women of Greece, fed up with the endless Peloponnesian War, decide to go on a sex strike. They refuse all intimacy with their husbands until the men agree to make peace. The play is filled with hilarious scenes of men walking around in agony, their prop phalluses comically erect, begging their wives to relent. It is a riotous battle of the sexes that plays on every stereotype of the lustful husband and the clever, determined wife. While it is a fantasy, it gives you a rare glimpse into the idea that women's desire, or the withholding of it, could be a source of real power. Then you might see a play like Assemblywomen, where the women of Athens, disguised as men, sneak into the assembly and vote themselves into power. One of their new policies is a radical sexual redistribution plan to ensure that even the old and unattractive women get a share of male attention. A law is passed forcing young, handsome men to sleep with an old woman before they can be with a young, beautiful one. The play ends with a young man being comically dragged off by three hideous hags. It is a joke, of course, but it is a joke that hinges on the audience's shared understanding of who is considered desirable and who is not. Here's a small but telling detail about the language of comedy. The plays are littered with an incredible variety of slang for body parts and sexual acts, much of which is so specific and colloquial that modern translators still argue about the exact meaning. They had a whole vocabulary for this stuff that you would never find in a philosophical dialogue or a tragic play. This was the language of the street and the tavern, and it was put on stage for everyone to hear. But the most important thing these comedies do is police the boundaries of acceptable male behavior. They are merciless in their mockery of the kina eidos, the effeminate man who takes the passive role. Aristophanes is constantly accusing his political rivals of being passive, of having been wide-arsed in their youth. These were not just random insults. They were carefully targeted attacks on their masculinity and, by extension, their fitness for public office. By laughing at the kina eidos, the audience of citizen men was reinforcing its own collective identity as active, dominant, and properly masculine. This brings us to a major question for classicists and theater historians. What was the real function of all this obscenity? Was it just letting off steam? A form of harmless carnival where normal rules were temporarily suspended for the sake of a good laugh? Or did it serve a deeper social and political purpose? Some scholars argue that the comedy was a vital democratic institution, a place where even the most powerful figures could be held accountable and where uncomfortable social truths could be aired in a humorous way. It was a safety valve for the city's engines. Others argue that the comedy, despite its wildness, was ultimately conservative. By making a joke out of women taking power or effeminate men, it was actually reinforcing the traditional patriarchal and masculine norms. It showed the audience what happened when the natural order was turned upside down. And the lesson was that it led to chaos and absurdity. The laughter was not just fun. It was a tool for social control. The debate over whether these plays were really subversive or secretly conservative is still very much alive. The comedies give you the perspective of the citizen male, the guy sitting next to you on the stone bench, but his experience of love and desire, as privileged as it is still not the whole story. The theater, the symposium, the agora, these are all stages for the citizen. But much of the actual labor of the city, including the labor of love and sex, was performed by people who were rarely the main characters, the slaves and the foreigners. Let us step away from the main stage. You have listened to the philosophers. You have laughed with the citizens at the theater, and you have peeked into the lives of wives and hetairai. But all of these stories are happening on a foundation built by a massive, largely silent population, the slaves. In a city like Athens, as much as a third of the population may have been enslaved. Their experiences of love, family, and desire are almost completely absent from the official record, and we are left to piece together a story from scraps and whispers. A slave in the ancient Greek world was not considered a person under the law. They were property, a living tool. As Aristotle chillingly put it, they could be bought, sold, beaten, and branded at the will of their owner. This fundamental lack of bodily autonomy shaped every aspect of their personal lives. A slave could not legally marry. Any relationship they formed, whether with another slave or someone else, was not recognized by the state. It was a contubernium, a sharing of a tent, not a marriage. the children of a female slave, regardless of who the father was, even if it was the master himself, were born into slavery. They automatically belonged to the mother's owner. This created a system of self-perpetuating human property. For a slave couple, the threat of separation was constant. A master could sell the husband or wife at any time, for any reason, with no regard for their family bond. The profound emotional trauma of this reality is almost impossible for us to fully comprehend. The sexual exploitation of slaves was not just common. It was an assumed right of the owner. A master had unrestricted sexual access to his slaves, both male and female. It was not considered adultery or any kind of crime for him to have sex with his own slaves. This was simply an extension of his property rights. The psychological impact on the citizen wife, who had to live in a household where her husband regularly had sex with the women who served her, is a subject the male authors rarely touch upon. Beyond the household, you had the vast numbers of slaves working in horrific conditions, like the silver mines at Lorient. These were men, often prisoners of war, who were literally worked to death. The idea of them having any kind of personal or romantic life is almost unthinkable. Their existence was one of brutal, unceasing labor. And what about foreigners? The metexmi troikoi. These were resident aliens, traders, craftsmen, intellectuals like Aristotle himself, who lived in Athens but were not citizens. They were free, but they had fewer rights. A metic could not own land in Attica and could not vote or hold office. Crucially, a metic could not legally marry an Athenian citizen. Any such union would not be recognized, and their children would not be citizens. This created a clear social and romantic barrier, keeping the citizen body pure. The Hetohero Aspasia, despite her influence and her long relationship with Pericles, was a mendicant, could never be his legal wife. Here is a small, heartbreaking detail that gives us a window into the emotional world of these marginalized groups. On ancient tombstones, you sometimes find inscriptions that hint at the deep bonds formed outside the law. You might see a tombstone dedicated by one slave to his concubernal, his partner, using language of love and grief that is just as powerful as any citizen's epitaph. Or you might find the grave of a child born to a citizen father and a foreign mother, a child who could never be a citizen, but who was clearly loved and mourned. These small archaeological finds are our only real evidence for the families and relationships that the law refused to see. This leads to a profound and difficult question for historians who try to write a more inclusive story of the past. How can we recover the experiences of people who left almost no written records of their own? The voices of slaves and foreigners are almost always filtered through the lens of the elite, citizen authors who owned them or wrote about them. Can we ever truly understand their perspective? Some historians try to read against the grain of the elite texts, looking for moments where the slave's voice seems to break through, even in a comedy or a court speech. Others turn to archaeology, arguing that the simple, everyday objects, the cooking pots, the tools, the humble graves, tell a more democratic story than the grand literary texts. The debate on how to write a history from below for the ancient world is a constant challenge. We know these millions of people there worked and loved. They built the temples, rowed the ships, and raised the children. But their personal stories are a vast, silent continent on the map of ancient history. Their lives were grounded in the physical reality of their bodies and their labor. And for the citizen men who ruled this world, the male body itself was a site of public performance, not just in war or politics, but in the one place where it was put on full display for all to see. You are back in the heart of the city, but it is a space that feels different from the marketplace or the theater. This is the gymnasium. The word itself comes from the Greek gym-nos, which means naked. And that is the first thing you notice. The men and youths training here, running, wrestling, throwing the discus and javelin, are doing so completely nude. This is not a shocking or shameful sight. It is the normal, expected state of affairs. The public nudity of the male citizen in the gymnasium is a core pillar of Greek culture. This was not a universal practice in the ancient world. The Greeks themselves were very aware of this. The historian Herodotus notes that for most non-Greek peoples, the barbarians, it was a source of shame to be seen naked. The Greeks, however, took immense pride in it. For them, it was a marker of civilization, a sign of their commitment to physical perfection and their difference from the rest of the world. The gymnasium was far more than just a sports center. It was a social and educational hub for the male citizenry. It was here that boys and young men would spend a significant portion of their day, not just training their bodies, but also learning from their elders. Philosophers like Plato and Aristotle often taught in or near gymnasia, like the academy and the lyceum, engaging students in conversation after their physical training was done. It was a place where the body and mind were meant to be cultivated in equal measure. The practice of exercising nude had a practical element. It was easier and more comfortable in the hot Greek climate. But its primary importance was cultural. The naked body was a public statement. A man's physique, honed by hours of disciplined training, was on display for his peers to see and judge. It was a visual testament to his virtue, his dedication to the city, and his readiness for war. A flabby, untrained body was a sign of laziness or indulgence, a mark of a poor citizen. And of course, this environment of beautiful, naked, athletic bodies was the primary stage for the courtship rituals of paiderastia. It was here that the older Eros would watch the youths, identify potential eromenos, and begin his process of courtship. The vase paintings you saw earlier, depicting courtship scenes set against a backdrop of athletic equipment, are a direct reflection of the gymnasium's social reality. It was a charged space, a marketplace of desire and mentorship. Here is a small, practical detail about this oily, dusty, naked environment. After exercising, an athlete's body would be covered in a mixture of sweat, dirt, and the olive oil they used to coat their skin. To clean themselves, they used a special tool called a S3X. This was a curved, metal scraper. The athlete would use it to scrape the gunk off his body. This oily residue, known as glow-ios, was considered to have medicinal properties. It was sometimes collected and sold by the attendants who ran the bathhouses, to be used in ointments and folk remedies. It is a slightly stomach-turning thought, but a vivid snapshot of daily life. The acceptance of male nudity stood in stark contrast to the treatment of the female body. As you know, a respectable citizen woman was expected to be completely covered and veiled when in public. Her body was private, hidden, and associated with the domestic sphere. The male body was public, displayed, and associated with the civic and military life of the polis. This stark visual difference was a constant, daily reinforcement of the gender roles that structured their entire society. But this raises a challenging question for historians of art and culture. Why this specific obsession with the male nude? The female nude does not become a major subject of mainstream Greek art until much later, with the famous statue of Aphrodite of K in Abydos by Praxiteles in the 4th century BCE. And even then, her nudity is often presented with a gesture of modesty, as if she has been surprised while bathing. She is an object of desire. But the male nude is an object of public virtue. Some scholars argue that the focus on the male nude is a direct result of the political structure of the city-state. Since only men were citizens and soldiers, the male body was the political body, the symbol of the city as strength and power. The health and discipline of the male form was a matter of state interest. Other historians argue that it is inextricably linked to the social institution of paiderastia. The gymnasium was the arena for this desire, and the art that celebrated the nude male form was a reflection and reinforcement of this homoerotic culture. The beautiful boy Kalos Pays was the ultimate artistic and erotic ideal. The debate continues over which came first. Did the military and political focus create the aesthetic? Or did the aesthetic and erotic culture shape the public display? This celebration of the idealized male body, this fusion of physical beauty and desire, all finds its divine patron in one particular goddess. She was not the goddess of marriage or the home. She was the goddess of something far more potent and far more dangerous. She was the irresistible force of nature that could make gods and mortals alike do foolish, wonderful, and terrible things out of all the scrubbing, meddling, and all the human gods on Mount Olympus. One figure embodies the raw, able power that has driven our entire story. She is not a goddess you pray to for a good harvest or a safe voyage. You pray to her either in hope or in fear, because she represents a force that can build a life or shatter it in an instant. She is Aphrodite, born from the sea foam that churned around the severed genitals of the sky god Uranus. A brutal and mythic origin story. Aphrodite is the goddess of beauty, love, pleasure, and procreation, but the love she oversees is not the gentle, companion Philia or the familial street orge. She is the mistress of Eros. She wields desire as a weapon and a gift. She is the divine source of that madness, that sickness, that overwhelming passion that the Greeks both feared and craved. In art, she is depicted as the pinnacle of female beauty, the living embodiment of the feminine ideal. Early on, she is shown clothed and regal, but by the 4th century BC, the sculptor Praxiteles makes a radical choice. He is commissioned to create a statue of the goddess for the city of Kos. He makes 2 versions, one clothed, one completely nude. The people of Kos are shocked by the nude version and choose the traditional, clothed one. But the nearby city of Athos snaps up the rejected nude statue, and it becomes the most famous sculpture in the ancient world. The Aphrodite of Athos set a new standard. For the first time, the nude female form becomes a celebrated subject of high art, and Aphrodite is its patron saint. Her power is absolute and inescapable. In the myths, she has a magical girdle, Alcestis airs, which has the power to make the wearer irresistible to gods and mortals alike. Even the wise and powerful Hera has to borrow it when she wants to seduce her own husband, Zeus, to distract him during the Trojan War. This girdle symbolizes Aphrodite's domain. She does not rule through strength or wisdom, but through the irresistible power of attraction. And she is famously vain and vengeful. Woe to any mortal who slights her or claims to be more beautiful than she is. The entire Trojan War, the most catastrophic event in Greek mythology, is kicked off because of her vanity. At a divine wedding, the goddess of discord throws a golden apple inscribed for the fairest. Aphrodite, Hera, and Athena all claim it. They ask the Trojan prince, Paris, to judge. Hera offers him power. Athena offers him victory in battle. But Aphrodite offers him the most beautiful mortal woman in the world. Helen of Sparta, Paris, of course, chooses Aphrodite, the goddess, true to her word, helps him abduct Helen, who is already married to the Spartan king, Menelaus. The result is a 10-year war that destroys Troy and costs countless lives, all for a beauty contest. Here is a curious little detail that shows her wide-ranging influence. Aphrodite was not just the goddess of romantic love. She was also the patron goddess of prostitutes. Itaira Ian Porne, I alike would offer prayers and sacrifices to her. In cities like Corinth, which was a major port and famous for its thriving sex trade, the main temple was dedicated to Aphrodite. For these women, she was not a symbol of abstract beauty, but their protector and the divine sanction for their trade. She was the goddess of the transaction, the pleasure, and the business of sex. Her worship was not always the stately, official ritual you would find at a temple of Zeus or Athena. It could be much more personal and magical. Archaeologists have found countless small, lead curse tablets from the Greek world, but not all of them are for cursing enemies. Many are binding spells related to love. A man, consumed with desire for a woman or another man, would inscribe a tablet with a magical formula, invoking Aphrodite's power. He would ask the goddess to bind the object of his affection, to make them unable to eat, sleep, or think until they came to him. These tablets would then be folded, pierced with a nail, and deposited in a grave or a sacred well, a kind of magical direct mail to the underworld gods who could enforce the spell. This magical dimension of her worship raises a question that historians of religion continue to explore. How did the average Greek person really perceive Aphrodite? Was she a beautiful, anthropomorphic goddess, a real being on Mount Olympus? Or was Aphrodite simply the name they gave to the overwhelming, impersonal force of desire itself? When a man felt a sudden, powerful attraction, did he think the goddess Aphrodite is influencing me? Or did he think I am feeling the emotion that we call Aphrodite? The line between the literal goddess and the metaphorical force was likely blurry for most people. Some scholars argue for a very literal belief, pointing to the temples and rituals. Others suggest a more psychological interpretation, seeing the gods as personifications of human emotions on natural forces. The worldview have been exploring this complex, contradictory system of marriage, mentorship, prostitution, and poetry is the world Aphrodite built. But nothing lasts forever. As the Greek city-states fade into new, vast power rises in the West. These ideas are about to be absorbed, translated, and transformed. The Romans are coming, and they have their own ideas about love and duty. The world is changing. The passionate, chaotic, and highly localized culture of the Greek city-states is being absorbed into something bigger, more organized, and, in many ways, more practical. You can feel the shift in the air. The language of power is slowly changing from Greek to Latin. You have arrived in the age of Rome. The Romans were the ultimate cultural importers. They looked at Greek art, literature, philosophy, and religion with immense admiration and proceeded to copy, adapt, and Romanize all of it. They took the Greek gods and gave them Roman names. Zeus became Jupiter, Hera became Juno, and the formidable Aphrodite was softened and domesticated into Venus, while Venus was still the goddess of love, beauty, and gardens. She often lacked the wild, terrifying edge of her Greek predecessor. She was a bit more respectable. The Romans inherited many of the Greek forms of relationship, but they imbued them with a distinctly Roman spirit. The Roman sensibility was less about philosophical ideals and more about duty pietas, gravity gravitas, and the power of the family familia as the cornerstone of the state. Take marriage. The Roman marriage, like the Greek one, was a crucial social and political institution, focused on property and producing legitimate heirs. However, by the late Republic and early Empire, Roman women of the upper classes enjoyed significantly more social freedom and legal rights than their Athenian counterparts. A wealthy Roman matron was not confined to a guinea seal. She could attend dinner parties with her husband, go to the games, and exert considerable influence behind the scenes. She was a public figure in a way an Athenian wife could never be. While her primary role was still domestic, she was a partner in building the family as prestige, not just a vessel for its continuation. The Roman attitude towards male-male relationships also underwent a crucial transformation. They adopted the Greek model of an older man with a younger partner, but they stripped it of the educational and philosophical justification of paideristia. For the Romans, it was a much simpler, cruder expression of power and status. A powerful Roman man could have a sexual relationship with a youth, but that youth was almost always a slave, a prostitute, or a foreigner. It was an assertion of his dominance. The key Roman taboo was for a freeborn Roman citizen to willingly take the passive role. This was seen as a profound disgrace, an act of self-enslavement that rendered him unfit for public life. The charge of being passive was a standard, and very potent, political smear. Julius Caesar, for example, was dogged his entire life by rumors that as a young man he had a passive relationship with King Nicomedes of Bithynia. His enemies never let him forget it, calling him the Queen of Bithynia. Here is a specific and fascinating Roman creation that did not really have a Greek equivalent: the professional male sex symbol. In the Roman arena, the gladiator was the ultimate masculine icon. He was a hyper-masculine figure, often a slave or prisoner of war, who faced death for public entertainment. And a successful gladiator could become a massive celebrity, a heartthrob for the ages. We have graffiti from Pompeii, where women scrawl messages of adoration for their favorite fighters. One famous bit of graffiti declares a gladiator named Sal Attus the sigh of the girls, sus by Rumpulorum. They were brutal, low-status entertainers, but also objects of intense erotic fantasy for men and women alike. Prostitution in Rome was, like in Greece, widespread, legal, and taxed. Roman brothels, known as lupenaria wolf dens, were a common feature of any city. The famous preserved brothel in Pompeii gives us a vivid look, with its small stone beds and explicit frescoes on the walls depicting various services offered. But as you look at all these continued ties and changes, a major historical question emerges. Did the Romans truly understand the Greek culture they so admired and imitated? Or did they fundamentally misinterpret it, taking the external forms while missing the inner spirit? For example, when a Roman aristocrat filled his villa with copies of Greek statues celebrating the athletic male nude, was he connecting with the Greek ideal of kailokagathia, the fusion of outer beauty and inner virtue? Or was he simply appreciating it as decorative art, a status symbol to show off his sophisticated Greek taste? Many scholars argue that the Romans were pragmatists who took what was useful from the Greeks and discarded the rest. They admired Greek intellect but were suspicious of its softness. They adopted the forms of paideristia but saw it through a Roman lens of domination and submission, not mentorship. Others argue for a deeper, more nuanced transmission of culture, where Greek ideas genuinely shaped Roman thought, even if they were altered in the process. The debate over creative appropriation versus fundamental misunderstanding is central to how we see the relationship between these two foundational cultures. This Roman world, a blend of Greek inheritance and Roman pragmatism, would dominate the Mediterranean for centuries. But a new idea, born in a small, remote province of the empire, was beginning to spread. It was a belief system that would look upon the entire Greco-Roman sexual landscape, the gods, the brothels, the symposia, the gymnasia, with absolute horror. A new morality was coming, and it would change the world forever. The air in the Roman Empire is starting to change. A new sound is cutting through the noise of the forum and the arena. It is a quieter sound. At first, a whisper in the back alleys of cities. A hymn sung in a private home. It is the sound of a new faith, one that grew out of Judaism in the province of Judea, Christianity, and its ideas about the body, desire, and the soul are so radically different from the Greco-Roman world. You have been exploring that they constitute a revolution for the followers of this new faith. The pantheon of Greco-Roman gods was not just a collection of false idols. They were demons. The stories of Zeus's affairs and Aphrodite's manipulations were not amusing myths. They were accounts of demonic deception. The entire moral universe that saw Eros as a divine force was turned on its head. Desire was no longer a cosmic madness sent from outside. It was an internal corruption, a symptom of humanity's fallen nature, a temptation to be fought and conquered from within. The focus shifted dramatically from the social to the personal, from the community to the individual soul. What mattered was not your public role, active or passive, citizen or slave, but the state of your inner self in the eyes of a single, powerful, and morally perfect God. This new morality was universal. It applied to everyone, emperor and slave alike. The old hierarchies of status, which had defined Greek and Roman sexual ethics, were suddenly irrelevant in the face of divine judgment. One of the most radical new ideas was the celebration of chastity. In the Greco-Roman world, for a man to be celibate was strange, even suspicious. It meant he was failing in his civic duty to marry and produce heirs. But for the early Christians, particularly thinkers like the Apostle Paul, virginity was elevated to a supreme spiritual state. To renounce sex was not to be less of a person. It was to be more holy. It was a way of dedicating one's entire being to God, free from the messy, worldly distractions of the flesh. The body was no longer a site for demonstrating civic virtue through athletics, but a temple for the Holy Spirit, which had to be kept pure. Marriage was still valued, but its purpose was refrained. It was seen as a sacred union, a sacrament, but also as a concession to human weakness. Paul famously writes in his first epistle to the Corinthians, "It is better to marry than to burn with passion." Marriage became the only legitimate container for sexual desire, a way to channel its aphy and prevent the sin of porneia, a term that for Christians encompassed not just prostitution, but any sexual activity outside of the marital bed. Adultery was a sin for the husband just as it was for the wife, a violation of a sacred vow before God, not just a property crime against another man. The double standard did not vanish overnight, but the theological foundation for it was destroyed. Here is a small detail that shows the depth of this change. The early church fathers spent an enormous amount of time writing and thinking about lust, not just the act, but the thought. Jesus' Sermon on the Mount includes the line, "Anyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her in his heart." This was a revolutionary concept. The Greco-Roman world cared about actions and their social consequences. Christianity cared about your internal state, your thoughts, your desires. The battleground had moved from the city streets into the human mind. All forms of non-procreative sex, which had been a casual part of the Greco-Roman landscape, were now condemned. Same-sex relations, which the old world had judged based on social roles, were now condemned outright as unnatural and sinful acts, regardless of who was active or passive. Prostitution was no longer a state-regulated necessity, but a moral evil. Even within marriage, sex was viewed with suspicion by some of the more ascetic church fathers. Some argued it was permissible only for the specific purpose of procreation. Pleasure for its own sake was a dangerous temptation. This brings us to a historical debate of massive significance. Why did this new morality win? Why did the Christian view of sexuality, so alien to the traditions of 1,000 years, eventually triumphant become the dominant moral code of the entire Western world? One school of thought argues that the Roman Empire was in a state of moral decay, and Christianity offered a comforting sense of order, meaning, and spiritual certainty in a chaotic world. Its high moral standards and strong community bonds were appealing. Another argument, championed by historians like Peter Brown, is that the appeal of the renunciation of the flesh was a powerful new way for an individual to assert control and find meaning in their life. In a world of absolute imperial power, the one thing a person could control was their own body and its desires. Asceticism became a new form of heroism. I third viewpoints to the political conversion of Emperor Constantine in the early 4th century. Once the faith gained the backing of the Roman state, its spread was assured through political power and institutional support. The debate over whether Christianity triumphed because of its intrinsic spiritual appeal, its social advantages, or its political luck continues to this day. As this new worldview took hold, the old world was literally buried. Temples were torn down or converted into churches. Statues of Aphrodite were smashed. The scrolls in the great libraries containing the works of poets and playwrights were left to rot or were actively destroyed. For centuries, the vibrant, complex world of Greek and Roman sexuality was lost, condemned, and forgotten. It was only much later that we would begin to dig it up again. The new faith has washed over the old world, and for more than 1,000 years, the society you have been exploring lies dormant under layers of earthen disapproval. The stories of Symposia and Hetairai, of paid Eristia and the rites of Demeter, are mostly lost, preserved only in the texts copied by monks who often added notes in the margins about how depraved their ancestors were. But then, starting in the Renaissance and accelerating dramatically in the 18th and 19th centuries, a new kind of explorer emerges, the archaeologist, armed with shovels, brushes, and a burning curiosity. These scholars begin to systematically dig into the ruins of the past. They are not just looking for treasure or grand marble statues for museums. They are looking for the texture of daily life, and what they find begins to either confirm, complicate, or completely contradict the stories told in the ancient texts. Imagine you are standing at the edge of a trench in the volcanic ash of Pompeii in the 1800 seconds. A worker calls out. They have uncovered a wall. As they carefully brush away the ash, a fresco is revealed. It is not a portrait of an emperor or a scene from Homer. It is a piece of graffiti, hastily scrawled nearly 2,000 years ago. It reads, "I came here and had sex. Then I went home." It is crude, funny, and breathtakingly human. It is a voice from the past that you would never hear in the polished histories of Tacitus or the speeches of Cicero. Archaeology gives a voice to the voiceless. The literary sources we have are almost exclusively from the pens of elite, educated men. They tell us what they thought was important. But archaeology unearths the world of everyone else. The discovery of the simple bronze tokens from a brothel tells us more about the mechanics of the sex trade than any philosophical text. The humble grave of a slave, buried with a few personal trinkets, speaks volumes about the capacity for love and grief even in the most oppressive circumstances. Sometimes, the archaeological finds confirm the literary sources in stunning detail. When archaeologists excavated the city of Olyndus in northern Greece, a city that was destroyed in 348 BCE, They found the houses exactly as they were left. They could clearly identify the layout described in texts. The undrawn, the men's dining room, with its raised border for the couches and its off-centered or designed to prevent people in the courtyard from seeing inside. They found the loom weights in the gynecea, the women's quarters, exactly where the texts said a wife would be working. It was like walking into a three-dimensional version of the world described by Plato and Xenophon. Here is a small but fascinating example of archaeology filling in a blank. The ancient texts talk a lot about the Hitara and their beauty. But what did they actually use to achieve it? In tombs and the remains of houses, archaeologists have found the ancient equivalent of a makeup bag. They have found tiny pots, called PYXites, still containing traces of the cosmetics themselves. They have analyzed these residues and found coal for eyeliner, made from lead sulfide, and rouge for the cheeks and lips, made from red ochre or the root of the old king tea plant. They have even found the little bronze or bone tools used for applying it all. It is a tangible connection to the beauty rituals that were so important in this world. But archaeology can also challenge the written record. For centuries, our understanding of Sparta was dominated by the almost utopian vision of writers like Plutarch, who saw it as a perfectly disciplined, austere society. But archaeological excavations in Sparta have uncovered surprisingly luxurious items from certain periods, beautifully carved ivory figures, fine pottery, and ornate bronze work. This suggests that the reality of Spartan life might have been far less severe and monolithic than the Spartan mirage created by the ancient authors. It complicates the myth. This tension between the texts and the dirt leads to one of the most fundamental and ongoing debates in the study of ancient history. Which source do you trust more? The texts give you the ideas, the philosophy, the laws, the why. The archaeology gives you the stuff, the physical reality, the what. What happens when they do not agree? Some historians, often called the literary camp, argue that the texts must be primary. Without them, archaeology is just a collection of mute objects. We need the writings of Plato to understand the culture of the symposium. Even if the cups we dig up sometimes tell a different story, the archaeological camp argues the opposite. The texts are propaganda, the biased views of a tiny, privileged minority. The physical evidence of the vast majority of people is a more reliable, more democratic source of truth. The household shrines, the diet revealed by animal bones, the patterns of trade shown by pottery. This is the real history. The debate forces historians to be detectives, constantly weighing different kinds of evidence, looking for corroboration, and acknowledging the gaps and contradictions in our knowledge. Through this slow, patient work of digging, the world you have been visiting has been pieced back together, fragment by fragment. It is a world that was once buried and condemned, but its influence never truly went away. In fact, as you return to your own time, you might be surprised to see just how many echoes of this ancient world still linger in our own. And so, you find yourself back in your own time. The scent of olive oil and dust is gone, replaced by the familiar hum of modern life. The journey is over. But is it really? The world of ancient Greece, with its strange customs and alien mindset, might feel a million miles away. And yet, if you look closely, you will see its ghost everywhere. The ideas about love, beauty, and desire that were born in those sun-drenched city-states are woven so deeply into the fabric of our own culture that we often do not even notice them. Think about the language we use. Every time you talk about something being platonic, you are, however inaccurately, invoking Plato's ladder of love. Every time you hear the word narcissism. You are referencing the myth of Narcissus, the beautiful Greek youth who fell in love with his own reflection. The very word erotic comes directly from Eros, the chaotic Greek god of desire. Our psychological vocabulary is haunted by these ancient concepts. Our standards of beauty, especially in the West, are the direct descendants of the Greek ideal, the idea of a classical body, the celebration of athletic fitness, the mathematical proportions of the perfect face. All of this is a legacy of the statues carved in Athens too. 500 years ago, we may have swapped the gymnasium for a fitness center and marble for magazines. But the underlying obsession with achieving a culturally defined physical perfection is a straight line back to kalokargathia. The pressure to have a good body as a sign of self-discipline and virtue is a profoundly Greek idea. Think about our political and social debates. The ongoing arguments about the nature of marriage, the roles of men and women, and the definition of a family often echo the questions the Greeks were asking. The tension between marriage as a romantic union of two individuals and marriage as a social institution for raising children is a conflict that was alive and well in the ancient world. The very concept of a double standard for male and female sexual behavior is a debate we inherited directly from. Here is a specific modern echo that might surprise you. The modern Olympic Games, revived in 1896, were a conscious attempt to recreate the spirit of the ancient Greek games, but the founder, Pierre de Coubertin, and the early organizers made a very specific and very great choice. They decided the games should be for men only. Their reasoning, echoing the ancient justifications, was that the intense competition was not ladylike and that a woman's physique was not suited for it. It took decades of struggle for female athletes to gain a foothold, fighting against a prejudice that was thousands of years old. Even our entertainment is filled with Greek DNA. The buddy comedy genre, to male friends navigating the world together, is a distant cousin of the Philia-based bonds celebrated in Greek culture. The romantic comedy, with its plot of overcoming obstacles to unite two lovers, often plays with the theme of Eros as a disruptive, but ultimately wonderful force. But perhaps the most important legacy is the debate itself, the very act of questioning, of analyzing love and desire, of trying to understand its place in society and in our own lives. That is the ultimate Greek inheritance. They were the first to systematically dissect these feelings, to try to categorize them, to argue about them in public and in private. They put love on trial in their courtrooms, on stage in their theaters, and on the couch in their symposia. This leaves us with one final, unresolved question that historians and sociologists are still very much debating today. Are the similarities we see between our world and theirs the result of a direct, unbroken line of cultural transmission? Did these Greek ideas survive through Roman law, Christian theology, and Renaissance art to shape our modern world directly? Or are we simply seeing patterns of human behavior that tend to emerge in any complex, patriarchal society? Is it a case of direct inheritance, or of parallel evolution? Some scholars trace a clear lineage, showing how a specific Platonic idea, for instance, was picked up by Roman thinkers, reinterpreted by medieval theologians, and then rediscovered by modern philosophers. Others argue that while the classical world provides a useful vocabulary, the social structures we live in today, capitalism, the nation-state, modern science, are so different that any comparison is superficial. The debate over how much of our modern soul is truly Greek is a testament to the enduring power and complexity of the world they built. You started this journey to understand a foreign country, the past, but you ended by realizing that you have, in many ways, been holding a mirror out to your own world, your own loves, and your own life. And with that, our journey comes to a close. The torchlight from the ancient procession has flickered out. The dust has settled in the gymnasium, and the last echoes of Sappho's lyre have faded into the gentle Aegean breeze. Oh, the vibrant, chaotic, and intensely human lives we have witnessed tonight have returned to the quiet earth. Their stories now just whispers in the long corridors of time. Feel the weight of the day begin to lift from your shoulders, like a heavy cloak slipping to the floor. Your breathing deepens, slowing to the steady, quiet rhythm of the sleeping world outside your window. The boundary between your thoughts and the stories you have heard begins to blur and soften, mingling together into the gentle fabric of a dream. Perhaps you are standing on a sun-bleached stone step in Athens, or maybe you are watching the slow, silent drift of the stars over a sleeping island. The details do not matter anymore. All that matters is this feeling of peaceful release, this sense of floating in the warm, quiet space between wakefulness and sleep. Let the last of your thoughts dissolve like sugar in warm water, leaving only a sense of calm. You are safe. You are comfortable. And you are drifting now, carried on a slow and silent current towards a deep and restorative rest. There is nothing left to do, nothing left to figure out. Just allow yourself to sink a little deeper, to let go a little more, and to embrace the profound peace of the coming sleep.